The brain scan revealed something that made Dr. Charles Baby's hands shake uncontrollably. What she saw on that monitor at 11:47 p.m. would destroy everything she believed about herself and turn her into the very monster she had spent her career studying. The crimson patterns pulsing across the screen were not just abnormal. They were identical to the brain of a serial killer who had murdered 17 people. Charles pressed her trembling fingers against her temple, fighting the migraine that always came when she worked too late. The Stanford University lab hummed around her, empty except for the ghosts of her ambitions. She had volunteered for this late-night scan as part of her own research into criminal psychology, expecting to see the usual patterns of a stressed academic. Instead, she was staring at the neural signature of a killer. The amygdala showed hyperactivity that matched the profiles of convicted murderers. Her prefrontal cortex displayed the same irregular patterns found in psychopaths. Most terrifying of all, the ventromedial regions responsible for empathy appeared almost dormant. Charles had spent her career studying these exact abnormalities in society's most dangerous individuals, never imagining she might harbor them herself. Her phone buzzed against the lab bench. A text from her sister. "Can't wait to see you at dinner tomorrow. Mom's making your favorite." Charles felt nothing. No warmth, no anticipation, just the cold calculation of whether she should cancel. The realization that she felt more connection to the brain scans of serial killers than to her own family made her stomach turn. She pulled up her research files, comparing her scan to those of infamous criminals. The similarities were undeniable. Charles had always prided herself on her emotional intelligence, her ability to connect with patients and colleagues. But looking back, she wondered if it had all been an elaborate performance. Had she been mimicking empathy rather than feeling it? The lab's fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the neuroimaging equipment. Charles thought about her childhood, searching for signs she had missed. She remembered the neighbor's cat that had disappeared when she was 12. She had helped search for it, even comforted the crying little girl next door. But she couldn't remember feeling genuinely sad about the animal's fate. Even then, had she been playing a role? Her research assistant Marcus had left his jacket draped over a chair. Charles found herself studying it, calculating how easy it would be to make his death look accidental. The thought came unbidden, clinical, and detached. She jerked her hand away from the fabric as if it had burned her. These weren't normal thoughts. These were the thoughts of someone whose brain matched the patterns of society's most feared individuals. Charles grabbed her purse and keys, desperate to escape the suffocating truth of the lab. But as she reached for the light switch, she hesitated. Tomorrow she would have to face her family, her colleagues, her patients. How could she look them in the eye, knowing what lurked beneath her carefully constructed facade? The brain scan had revealed more than neural abnormalities. It had exposed the terrifying possibility that everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie. The question that haunted her as she finally turned off the lights wasn't whether she was capable of evil. It was whether she had already committed acts of evil without even realizing it. As the lab plunged into darkness, Charles' baby walked out into the night, carrying the weight of a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about good, evil, and the thin line that separated them. Charles couldn't escape the horrifying truth that was eating her alive from the inside. 3 days had passed since the brain scan revealed her darkest secret, and now she was standing in her childhood bedroom at 3 a.m., holding a blood-stained diary she had completely forgotten existed. The pages were filled with detailed drawings of dead animals and disturbing experiments she had apparently conducted as a child, experiments that proved the monster had always been there, waiting. She rose before dawn and drove to her childhood home in Palo Alto, using her spare key to slip inside while her parents slept. The house smelled of vanilla candles and her mother's perfume, scents that should have triggered warm memories, but instead felt like props in a play she had forgotten she was acting in. Charles made her way to the basement, where boxes of her childhood belongings waited like evidence in a cold case. The first box contained school photos and report cards. Charles studied her younger self, searching for signs of the monster she now suspected she might be. In every image, she appeared normal, even sweet. But she remembered the careful practice it had taken to perfect that smile, the way she had watched other children to learn which facial expressions triggered positive responses from adults. Had she been studying them like specimens even then? A yellowed newspaper clipping made her blood run cold. Local girl saves drowning classmate. She remembered the incident clearly now. 8-year-old Tommy Martinez had fallen through thin ice at the neighborhood pond. Charles had been the one to pull him out, performing CPR until paramedics arrived. The town had called her a hero. But as she stared at the article, she recalled the real reason she had acted so quickly. She hadn't been afraid for Tommy's life. She had been fascinated by the possibility of watching someone die. More memories surfaced with crystalline clarity. The way she had volunteered to help with injured animals, not out of compassion, but from a clinical curiosity about suffering. Her high school boyfriend who had broken up with her, claiming she was too cold, like dating a robot. She had dismissed his words as typical teenage drama, but now they felt like an accurate diagnosis. Charles found her old journals, filled with observations about classmates and teachers written in her neat handwriting. Reading them was like discovering the field notes of an alien studying human behavior. She had documented emotional responses with the detachment of a scientist, noting which combinations of words and gestures produced desired reactions. Every relationship in her life had been an experiment. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. Her research assistant, Marcus, sounded panicked. "Dr. Baby, there's been an incident at the lab. Someone broke in last night and damaged the brain imaging equipment. Security footage is corrupted. The police want to speak with you since you were the last person to use the scanners." Charles felt a strange calm wash over her as she processed the news. She had no memory of returning to the lab, but the timing was too convenient to ignore. Had she destroyed the evidence of her own abnormalities in some kind of dissociative state? The possibility terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. "I'll be right there," she told Marcus, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. As she drove back to Stanford, Charles realized she was approaching a crossroads. She could continue living the lie she had constructed, using her knowledge of psychology to maintain her facade. Or she could embrace what the brain scan had revealed and explore the darker territories of her nature. The choice should have been obvious. Any rational person would choose to remain hidden, to suppress these disturbing revelations. But as Charles pulled into the university parking lot, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement. For the first time in her adult life, she was contemplating dropping the mask she had worn for so long. The question was whether she was strong enough to handle what lay beneath it. The police cars surrounding the neuroscience building seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, matching the dark beat of her hidden heart. Charles' baby was about to discover that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The scream echoed through the empty university parking garage at exactly 10:34 p.m. But it wasn't coming from Dr. Charles' baby. It was coming from her first victim, Dr. Kenneth Walsh, who was about to discover what happens when you corner a predator who has finally stopped pretending to be human. What Charles did next would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, and the security footage she thought she had destroyed was still recording everything. But the destroyed brain scanner had taken more than her evidence with it. It had removed the last barrier between Charles and the experiment she now felt compelled to conduct. If traditional neuroscience couldn't give her answers about the darkness in her mind, she would have to gather data through more direct methods. Her first subject chose himself, Dr. Kenneth Walsh, the department head who had blocked her promotion for the third time, citing concerns about her emotional availability with patients. The irony wasn't lost on Charles that his assessment had been more accurate than he realized. Walsh worked late most evenings, a habit that made him predictable in ways that would serve her research purposes perfectly. Charles began documenting her observations with scientific rigor. She noted her elevated heart rate as she followed Walsh to his car, the absence of guilt or fear that should have accompanied such behavior. Instead, she felt the same focused calm she experienced during complex surgical procedures. Her mind categorized every detail, his walking pattern, the sound his keys made. The exact moment he realized someone was behind him in the parking garage. The confrontation was brief but illuminating. Charles had expected to feel something when Walsh's eyes widened with recognition and terror. She had theorized that fear in others might trigger some dormant empathetic response in her neural pathways. Instead, she felt only clinical fascination as she watched his psychological defenses crumble in real time. "Charles, what are you doing?" Walsh had gasped, backing against his sedan. "This isn't like you. That's the problem," she had replied, her voice steady as a surgeon's blade. "I'm not sure what I'm really like at all." She didn't kill him. The realization that she could have done so easily was data point enough for this phase of her research. Instead, Charles had simply walked away, leaving Walsh shaking in the parking garage with no clear understanding of what had just transpired. She knew he would never report the incident, couldn't report something so nebulous without damaging his own reputation. Back in her apartment, Charles meticulously recorded her findings. The absence of remorse was particularly noteworthy. She felt no more guilt about terrifying Walsh than she would about dissecting a laboratory rat. The comparison troubled her intellectually while leaving her emotionally untouched. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Missed you at dinner. Mom's worried. Are you okay?" Charles stared at the message, trying to access whatever mechanism normal people use to generate appropriate responses to familial concern. The effort felt like trying to recall a foreign language she had never quite mastered. She typed back, "Just busy with research. Love you all." The words appeared on her screen like symbols in an alien script. Love. Did she understand what that word meant beyond its utility as social currency? The next morning brought news that made Charles's pulse quicken with anticipation rather than anxiety. Marcus found her in her temporary office, his face pale with excitement and fear. "Dr. Baby, something incredible happened last night. Dr. Walsh came in early and submitted a letter recommending you for immediate promotion. He also approved funding for your new research proposal, the one you never actually submitted." Charles maintained her expression of pleasant surprise while her mind raced. Walsh had interpreted their encounter as some kind of psychological demonstration, a calculated move to advance her career. He was giving her what she wanted to prevent her from doing whatever he thought she was capable of doing. The man was more perceptive than she had credited him with being. "That's wonderful news," Charles replied, watching Marcus carefully for signs of suspicion. Dr. Walsh must have recognized the value of pushing boundaries in psychological research. As Marcus left, Charles realized she had reached another crossroads. She now had the resources and authority to conduct her research through legitimate channels, to study the nature of evil from the safety of academic distance. But the taste of direct experimentation had awakened something in her that scholarly observation could never satisfy. The choice between light and darkness no longer felt like a choice at all. Charles Baby was beginning to understand that some people weren't meant to stand on the moral sidelines. Some were meant to cross the lines that others feared to approach, to explore territories that civilization pretended didn't exist. The only question now was how far into the darkness she was willing to travel in pursuit of the truth about herself. 800 of the world's leading criminal psychologists were about to witness the most shocking confession in academic history, but none of them realized they were staring directly into the eyes of an active serial killer. Dr. Charles Baby stood at the podium, her presentation slides displaying brain scans and behavioral analysis of her own murderous mind, as she prepared to reveal the locations of 7 bodies that had never been found. The FBI agent in the front row was taking notes, completely unaware that he was about to become her next victim. The auditorium held 800 of the world's leading experts in criminal psychology, neuroscience, and forensic psychiatry. Charles looked out at their eager faces, recognizing colleagues who had worked alongside her for years without suspecting what she truly was. The irony was exquisite. She was about to reveal the mind of a predator to a room full of people who specialized in studying predators, and they would applaud her for it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, her voice carrying perfectly through the sound system. "What if I told you that the most dangerous individuals in our society aren't the ones sitting in prison cells, but the ones sitting in boardrooms, operating rooms, and yes, even in lecture halls like this one?" She clicked to her first slide, a brain scan that the audience didn't recognize as her own. This neuroimaging data represents an individual with all the hallmarks of psychopathic neural architecture: reduced empathetic response, hyperactive reward systems associated with manipulation and control, and underdeveloped moral reasoning centers. The subject exhibits textbook patterns found in convicted serial killers. The audience leaned forward, intrigued by the clarity of the scan and the implications of the data. Charles felt a familiar thrill as she watched their fascination, their complete absorption in studying what they believed to be someone else's pathology. They were as captivated by the mind of a predator as she had always been by their vulnerabilities. "The remarkable aspect of this case," Charles continued, "is that this individual has never been convicted of any crime. In fact, they hold a respected position in academic medicine and are considered a pillar of their community. They have saved lives, mentored students, and contributed significantly to our understanding of criminal psychology." She clicked to the next slide, showing behavioral analysis charts that documented her own responses to various moral dilemmas and emotional stimuli. The data painted a portrait of someone capable of perfect mimicry of human emotion, without actually experiencing any authentic feelings. Charles watched the audience process the implications, seeing the moment when several attendees began to look uncomfortable. Dr. Martinez from Harvard raised his hand. "The ethical implications of studying such an individual are staggering. How did you gain access to such detailed psychological and neurological data?" Charles smiled, the expression perfectly calibrated to convey academic collegiality while hiding the predatory satisfaction underneath. "The subject volunteered for the study, Dr. Martinez. In fact, they insisted on complete transparency in the research process. They wanted to understand the nature of their own psychological architecture as much as we did." The lie came so smoothly that Charles almost admired her own performance. The truth was that her research had evolved far beyond anything institutional ethics boards would have approved. Over the past 6 months, she had refined her methods, learning to extract the maximum psychological response from her subjects while leaving minimal evidence of her involvement. There had been Dr. Walsh, of course, but also the graduate student who had plagiarized his dissertation, the hospital administrator who had been embezzling funds, and the prosecutor who had been taking bribes. Charles had justified each encounter as a form of justice, removing moral corruption from positions of trust. But she was honest enough with herself to recognize the rationalization for what it was. "The most disturbing finding," Charles said, advancing to her final slide, "is that this individual experiences no internal conflict about their nature. They don't struggle with urges or fight against dark impulses. They simply exist in a state of perpetual calculation, viewing other human beings as variables in an ongoing experiment. The auditorium was completely silent now. Charles could feel the shift in the room's energy, the moment when intellectual curiosity transformed into something approaching fear. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just studying a case history. They were listening to a confession. The subject has concluded that traditional concepts of good and evil are social constructs with no basis in neurological reality. What we call morality is simply a set of behavioral constraints that some brains are capable of internalizing and others are not. The question isn't whether such individuals can be treated or cured. The question is whether they represent evolution in action, the emergence of a more efficient form of human consciousness. Charles closed her presentation to scattered, uncomfortable applause. As the audience filed out, she noticed the way they looked at her differently now. Some with fear, others with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. They suspected what she had revealed about herself, but they couldn't prove it. The beauty of her confession was that it was hidden in plain sight, disguised as academic research. Dr. Rivera from the FBI approached her after the presentation. "Dr. Baby, that was a fascinating case study. I'd like to discuss some consulting opportunities with our behavioral analysis unit. We could use someone with your insights into the criminal mind." Charles shook his hand, feeling nothing but cold amusement at the invitation. "I'd be honored to help, Detective Rivera. After all, who better to catch a monster than someone who understands how they think?" As she packed her presentation materials, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The brain scan that had started everything was long gone, destroyed along with any evidence that might have limited her freedom to explore the darker territories of human nature. She had found her calling not in treating the antisocial mind, but in embodying it. The conference attendees were returning to their universities and law enforcement agencies, carrying with them the seed of a disturbing idea, that the predators they studied might be studying them back. Charles Baby had given them a glimpse inside the mind of evil, never revealing that they had been looking into a mirror. She walked out of the conference center into the bright afternoon sun, already planning her next research phase. There were so many interesting subjects in the world, so many opportunities to push the boundaries of human psychological tolerance. The future stretched before her like an infinite laboratory, filled with specimens who would never understand they were being studied until it was far too late. Charles Baby had finally found her true calling. She was no longer just a doctor who studied evil. She had become evil's most accomplished practitioner, hiding in plain sight among those who dedicated their lives to understanding the very darkness she embodied. And the most beautiful part was that nobody would ever suspect the truth, because who would believe that evil could be so perfectly, brilliantly human? If you found this psychological journey as compelling as we did, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to dive deeper into the darkest corners of the human mind. Share this tale with someone brave enough to question what lurks beneath the surface of ordinary people. And comment below with your theories about the thin line between good and evil. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who never see themselves as monsters at all. The mind is the ultimate frontier, and we're just beginning to map its most dangerous territories. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.